Good afternoon. Yeah, and settle down. So what we are going to be doing today is to build on where we left yesterday. I didn't know I was to teach today too, but I'm here. Where did we leave yesterday? We left yesterday with global governance institutions, isn't it? We looked at global governance institutions that were part of what you call as the first wave of globalization. Enama, what has happened? Huh? Do I think I'm looking so funny? Huh? Do I look so funny? So what made you so happy? Okay, so you cool down and listen to me. Okay, all of you cool down and listen to me. You understand? Okay. So what we were saying is that we looked at the global institution in the first wave of globalization. What is the first wave of globalization? The colonization. Okay? What was the ideology of the first wave of globalization? What is that? Okay, civilize the world. Civilize the world. What were the instruments used to civilize the world? I understand something. Okay. But what was the ultimate objective of that colonization as globalization? To create free market. To create free market that provided for cheap labor, that provided for raw materials, and that provided for the buyers for the end products. Okay? The second wave of globalization is about what? The trigger was the oil crisis. And the oil crisis created conditions whereby most developing nations became indebted. So the bank and the fund that were created fundamentally to deal with reconstruction of Europe and in Japan became instruments for restructuring what? What were they supposed to restructure? The economies of the developing nations. Okay, so the bank and the fund becomes instruments, to restructure the economies of the developing nations. Okay, and what were the driving forces for that? What are the driving forces? The TNCs and MNCs on behalf of what? The developed world. Okay. Now, as you part this story of the first wave of globalization and the second wave of globalization, the end of the first wave of globalization that ended with the dismantling of colonies, isn't it? Dismantling of colonies was triggered by the end of the Second World War. Okay? And so you had a whole lot of nations became suddenly independent. What comes with independence? Huh? What comes with independence? The nation state. Suddenly non-subjects become subjects. Isn't it? Non-subjects become subjects. Or second-rate subjects become, subjects. And who are they? What's the relationship between you and the nation state? Who are you to the nation state? Citizen. Okay? You become a citizen. So the initial wave of independence from colonization and rearrangement of the relationship between nation state and individuals as state and citizens caught up with the idea of rights. Caught up with the idea of rights that individuals had certain rights and certain claims over the state, because the state, being independent, having become independent, must have some capabilities of meeting certain basic rights of the people. So the idea of rights and human rights started emerging at the end of the Second World War. And the primary instrument to facilitate the rights debate was what? The United Nations. The United Nations as the representative body of the nation states. United Nations is the representative body of the nation states, was charged with the responsibility of defining rights and creating conditions whereby rights can be defined and nation states can be motivated to secure the rights of the people, actually. And that's the difference between United Nations and the global governance, other global governance institutions. All other global governance institutions, the World Bank and IMF, were not representative bodies, isn't it? Because there the representation is based on what is your financial contribution to that institution. Those who had financial muscle, they had higher contribution, higher voting share, and the ability to make decisions in terms of how and on what conditions they would intervene to support nation states. But the United Nations was a different animal, actually. It was created on the principle of equality. So St. Kitts and Nevis, which has a 40,000 population, and India, which has 1.23 billion people, are equal. In terms of votes, that you can also cast one vote, so do the St. Kitts and Nevis would also cast one vote. But that's not the case with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. World Trade Organization was structured around all having equal voice, but unequally structured. I have the might, so I decide the rule. Anyway, so basically the idea that people have rights and that rights can be exercised honored by the state became an important issue. So what are human rights? What are human rights? That which a person is entitled to have, to do, to receive from others, which is enforceable by law. If you have a right to do something, sense that right to eat beef and pork, is it a right? Some people say it's a right. Some people say it's not a right. And I don't have any idea about it. Okay? But the right is what a person is entitled to have, to do. It's not just to have, but also to do. Okay? Or to receive from others, which is enforceable by law. You need to have, you have a right to receive, you have a responsibility to discharge, and which can be enforceable by law. You understand the three ideas? The human rights, in relation to the rights, is a universal legal guarantees protecting individuals and groups against actions and omissions that interfere with fundamental freedoms and human dignity. Okay. When the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, the values state that it treats all individuals equal, and you have rights and obligations, and one people's rights is not superior to another people's rights. If you demand rights, you have obligations to deal with, and rights cannot go without obligations as such. Okay? The universal legally guaranteed human rights are universally legal guarantees protecting individuals and groups against actions and omissions that interfere with fundamental freedoms and human dignity. How is it that the United States suddenly decides that it must bomb Iraq? The United States decides to bomb Iraq? It can decide. Listen here. The United States decides to bomb Iraq. What is the logic? Human rights. To protect the human rights of whom? What Iraqis? Which Iraqis? Anyway. So basically, where does it derive its power from to bomb Iraq? From the United Nations. From the Security Council, it derives its power to bomb Iraq to protect the human rights of people. Along the way, you also violate rights. Have you read body count? How many people read body count? How many people have been killed until now in Iraq? Okay, you read it and come back. So human rights law obliges governments and their agents, okay, to do some things and prevent them from doing others. Okay? In other words, the human rights law obliges governments and their agents to do some things. What are the some things? That you must make sure your people don't starve. You must make sure your people don't starve, but you cannot be party to making people starve. Isn't it? Government's responsibility ensure that people don't starve, but it cannot be party to make people starve. So it's not supposed to create a condition whereby some people starve. It cannot create a condition whereby some people face violence. It cannot create conditions whereby some people's rights are taken away. So it is supposed to do certain things, and it is not supposed to do certain things. Are we there? Okay. Now, that some of the debate around that time in the United Nations was spearheaded by Mrs. Roosevelt, as the chairperson of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Okay, what did Mrs. Roosevelt say at that point in time? Who was Mrs. Roosevelt? The wife of President of the United States of America. Okay, so I think it's very telling paragraph. So I copied it. Okay, what does it say? It says, in small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. St. Kitts and Nevis cannot be seen on any map of the world. It's a small thing. I could walk between one end to another end in 40 minutes. That's St. Kitts and Nevis. Yet, they are the world of the individual persons. That's a very powerful statement which, Mrs. Roosevelt would make. Yet, they are the world of the individual persons. Okay? the neighborhood she lives in, the school or college she attends, the factory, farm, or office she works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. In other words, if it doesn't have meaning in the smallest of the places, it has no meaning anywhere. I was teaching to, I don't know to whom I was teaching in the morning, 9 to 11. Whom I was teaching to? Not LLM group. Some MPhil PhD students, they are not part of it. I was talking to them about Niyamgiri. You heard of Niyamgiri? Niyamgiri. This is what Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt says. Do people, the cones of Niyamgiri have right to have access to their God? Do cones of Niyamgiri have right over the livelihoods which their ecosystem provides? Do they have a right to exist in the place where they exist? Yes, that's what. In the human rights parlance, that every individual, every group, small or big, have a right to exist in places where they exist with dignity and respect. Okay? By that token, it says if you were to alienate them from those rights, then you have responsibility to see how it can be alienated. Isn't it? Unless these rights have meaning there in Niyamgiri or in Nicobar Islands or in Kargil, why I am saying these names? They are remote areas. They are not in anybody's radar. But remote area, our M. East Ward is also a remote area for us. You know M. East Ward? You know M. East Ward? Have you heard of it? You know the infant mortality rate of M. East Ward is what? You know what is the infant mortality rate of M. East Ward? About 80 per 1,000 live births. What is the infant mortality rate of Kerala? 9 per 1,000 live births. Kerala, poor state. My neighbor. You know, what is the logic here that Kerala has an infant mortality rate of 9 per 1,000 live births and the financial capital of India has as a unit which has an infant mortality rate of 80 per 1,000 live births? Don't they have rights to have better health? Don't they? Do they? They have. But it's so very important that they must have. It's not so very important for everybody. Can you do this in South Mumbai? You can do it to some people, but not to all people. Anyway, so unless these rights have meaning there, they have very little meaning anywhere. In the sense that if the infant mortality rate of M. East Ward is 80 per 1,000 live births, if people's living conditions are so utterly bad, which is equivalent to the infant mortality level of the sub-Saharan Africa 20 years ago, then, this is not a financial capital. This is a capital which has several groups of people living there and who have no equal rights. Okay? But what human rights in Mrs. Roosevelt's sense said is that unless these rights have meaning there and they have little meaning anywhere, without concretized, concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, I think she comes to, how do you get it done? Unless concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. Beautiful words said in 1940s. Okay? Enormously meaningful, and it's meaningful then, it's meaningful now, it will be meaningful later too. Okay? These were the founding words for heading towards the idea of establishing human rights as an idea, human rights as a right. And that process has led to a situation whereby the nation states came together to create Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Okay? That all human beings have human rights. Very interesting, actually. All human beings have all human rights, and which cannot be violated by anybody else. Okay? Universal Declaration. All human beings are the same. So taking somebody's slave is a violation. Surplus extraction beyond a level is a violation. There could be a number of different violations that can come into the picture. Now, that's about a declaration that all human beings have human rights. Okay? Now, what is it? What is those human rights? How do you codify them? Okay? And that's where further codification of human rights comes into the picture. So the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, adopted and open for signature and ratification and accession by General Assembly in 16th December 1966, and it came into force 1976. It took 10 years. The economic, social, and cultural rights resolved in 1966, but came into force 1976. Because most nation states, all the nation states needed to sign on to that, or majority of the nation states needed to sign on to that in order for those rights to come on to force. Can you wake her up? Got enough sleep? Enough sleep? Don't sleep. I'm not singing now. I'm talking about human rights. Okay? Listen to human rights. And I have a right to demand that you listen to me. Do I have or not? So that I can sleep properly in the night. Okay. So, the economic, social, and cultural rights were created in 1966, where they came into force in 1976. Okay? What is economic rights? Right to life is an economic right. And right to life can have all, much of what the Supreme Court has been defining in terms of right to education, right to food, right to health, right to a whole lot of things, were all derived from the basic notion of right to life. Okay? Social rights, in the sense that you have a right to housing, right to water, sanitation, health, a whole lot of issues come into the right. Cultural rights. Niyamgiri people have a right to hold on to their culture. So is you, so is I. We have a right to our culture. What is culture? Yes? What is culture? The belief system, the values, the faith, isn't it? The belief system, the values, the faith. Okay. So when we went to Niyamgiri Hills, there was a 4-member committee appointed by the government of India to look at whether Niyamgiri can be mined for bauxite. So we walked up, the hills. It's about 2-3 hours of walk. It's a steep walk. When we went up there, the collectors of Rayagada and Kalahandi declared Sir, see, there is no God here. Because Niyamgiri people said that the peak has Niyamgiri Raja, but there is no Raja here. Now, the Khons are animistic, isn't it? Khons are animistic. For them, their faith, their God lives on all living beings. It's on it's on amla trees. It may be on the crow that is sitting out there. Now, to say that they must have a Raja out sitting there, the Rajas of course can't sit there forever, but a Murti to be sitting there, but animistic religion do not have that particular part of it. So when the collector said, sir, there is no, there's nothing, sitting out there. So what is the problem if it is to be mined? But they believe that the ancestral spirits reside there. Do we believe in ancestral spirit? Different people have different belief system. But to say that, to respect that they can have their belief system and we must respect that belief system is one thing. But to say my belief system is superior to your belief system is not the right thing actually. Okay? So economic, social and cultural rights become an important part of the basket of rights that was created in 1966 and came into force in 1976. And then the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights adopted and opened for signature and ratification and accession by General Assembly resolution something in 16th December 1966 and also came into force on 23rd March 1976. Why you didn't have civil and political rights along with economic, social and cultural rights? You can have a basket, isn't it? What is civil and political rights? Right to expression, freedom of speech, right to have one's views, freedom to live wherever you wish to live, freedom from fear and freedom from want, the whole lot of freedoms and political rights to vote, to elect governments, democratic rights. But they needed to be kept in two different baskets fundamentally because the Soviet bloc, which has been dismantled, the Soviet bloc wanted economic, social and cultural rights to be the supreme rights. The NATO bloc said that no, civil and political rights are very important. Civil and political rights are very important. Why do Americans bomb Libya, Syria, and all those countries? To bring democracy. To bring democracy, rights for everybody. Isn't it? This is the discourse of the United States of America that, the best system of governance is which respects everybody's rights is democracy. Okay, so you need to create democratic nations, and that has been its logic. But economic, social, and cultural rights can come later. If you have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, political rights, you would eventually have economic and social and cultural rights. But the Soviet bloc argued that you need to have equality in terms of access to and control over the means of production, and all must have equal access to and control over the means of production and distribution of the means of production. When you have it, there is a perfect equality. Equality in terms of economic and social and cultural terms is one thing, but equality in terms of everybody is being able to express in democracy is another form of freedom. The contestation between the two blocks became an extreme contestation, and the world was divided along, who belonged to which sides. And nations suffered actually because, their contestation on ideology was extremely important. And that's what happened with respect to these kinds of rights. Any questions here? Any questions? If you understand it well, I can go through. Go ahead. Okay. Now, this is again simple idea that the, citizenship and rights go together. What is the relationship between you and, do you have a contract with your nation state? Do you have? All the citizens have social contract with the nation state. Isn't it? And that social contract, compels the state to secure, protect, and deliver certain rights. Okay? So basically, the theory of social citizenship assumes that explicit contract between government and citizens, more synonymous to civil and political rights. Okay? You need to know from where Marshall has been writing. Okay? So, is synonymous to civil and political rights, implies that progressive achievement of civil and political rights, civil, political, social, and eventually economic rights. Much of the development theory is located within this broader ideology. That is that, if you are able to achieve civil and political rights, you would eventually achieve economic and social and economic rights. Along the way, some people will be poor. Like our MDG. What is our Millennium Development Goal tells you? I'll reduce the poverty by 50% by 2015. How does it matter if some people are poor even by 2015 and starving? That's, nation states develop that kind of, but that's not rights. All people have a right to remain, free from hunger. But that's a different kind of rights compared to what Millennium Development Goals will tell you. Again, that is also done by what? The United Nations. United Nations guidelines, MDG saying that, even by 2015, if some people are poor, that's okay. Some people are starving, that's okay. But whereas its own human rights would tell you that all people must be able to lead a dignified life. And a dignified life would assume that all people have right to have minimum basic needs met. Isn't it? But that's a contradiction, actually. Some institutions are contradictory. Not because they are structured that way. It is because they are being driven that way. But that's a side issue, actually. So, achieving political citizenship provoked call for social rights. Achieving political citizenship provoked call for social rights, since political rights are only effective if all citizens command adequate economic resources and security. That's what, Eleanor Roosevelt will tell you, what she says. She says that without concerted action to uphold them close to home, it won't happen. And that's what it says, that achieving political citizenship provoked call for social rights, right to housing, water, sanitation, equality, and that are only effective if all citizens have command over adequate economic resources and security. See, the idea of minimum basic needs. How do we define minimum basic needs? How do our government defines minimum basic needs? Huh? What is that? Poverty line. No. Poverty line, signifies a basket of basic needs that every individual must have. So whoever has an expenditure below that poverty line is not able to have a basket of basic needs as such. Okay? Sen would define it differently. Mother Teresa would have defined differently. Each one of you may define differently. Just before I was looking, we were planning for next year's admission. And somebody said we should say what is the nature of hostel we will be able to provide. Somebody said, let us add a word, modest hostel. Now, modest, does it mean the same to all of you? No, it doesn't mean same to all of you. Modest means so many different things to so many people. I said, you simply say that, you will be given accommodation. We will see later. Not in Mumbai, in Turjapur, Guwahati, and Hyderabad. Okay, all will be given accommodation, but don't say modest, because modest for somebody coming from Yavatmal and modest for coming from South Mumbai would be very different. Would be different or not? So we unnecessarily get into that logic actually. But here, when they say adequate economic resources and security, it's located in the nature of modest, basic minimum. Okay, a very comprehensive idea of welfare by the state, emphasizing equal and universally shared rights to all citizens, as well as a broad notion of social entitlements. Now, as the nation states mature, as the civil and political rights take stronger roots, okay, as the social rights are demanded, okay, definition of what is a minimum basic need would also get defined. And it's often defined in terms of what is the nature of social security the nation state is putting in place for its people, isn't it? What is the nature of social security that nation state is putting in place to address the needs of its people? All people may not have employment. All people may not have land. All people may not have. People need minimum basic food, calories to be consumed. All people would need minimum education to be achieved, minimum health standards to be achieved. So nation states eventually come to a situation whereby some minimum standards of social security is ensured for all people. Actually, that's what you come into. So citizenship and fulfillment of rights, they go together. But how it is understood, what is minimum, what is maximum, what is modest, what is basic minimum would differ in different contexts, but it is always possible to define what is that minimum. Okay? That people must be able to have minimum quality of water, minimum volume and quality of water. That's quite very important, isn't it? Now, where does this rights-based approach come into the picture? But before that, let me take you to an idea of development. Okay, the idea of development constructed on the basis of on the foundation of rights and freedoms. Okay, how do you construct that? Human rights is central to the concept of development. We'll be kidding, isn't it? But that's what it is, that human rights must be fundamental to the concept of development, that all, the development must deal with freedom from fear and freedom from want. Basic minimum freedoms is that. Freedom from fear, that you are not being violated freedom from want, in the sense that you have minimum basic quality of housing, water, sanitation, and employment, and livelihoods, and nutrition. You know, that becomes minimum. Yeah. Kodankulam. Now, Kodamkulam. Kodamkulam is a nuclear project, okay? And the state party says that people have a right to energy, power. Air-conditioned room, you know. It's nice to sit here, isn't it? People have right to power. And how do you generate that power? Okay? It's always in the rights development. The rights framework is a contestation between rights of some people against the rights of other people. Okay? Kodamkulam or any particular location within the nation states, all people need energy, power, for fulfilling the basic minimum of life. And that energy needed to be generated from varying sources. And nuclear power is one of those sources. Okay? Now, what is the argument here? By the state deciding that it must fulfill the energy needs of its people, it decides to place a nuclear power plant in Kodamkulam, and that violates or that takes away the rights of some groups of people. What are the rights that are taken away? One, it takes away the lands and livelihoods of people on which the plant is going to be located. Okay? And it also introduces certain levels of fear that the nuclear energy or nuclear processes may have, you know, health implications to people. They have fear. Okay? Now, so you have some people's livelihoods have been compromised. Some people's security has been threatened. Under the same time, the state is planning to do certain things in order to meet the power needs of its people. What do you do then? There is a contestation. Okay? All contestations can be addressed. I think that is what the right to development would tell you. All contestations can be addressed by dialogue, by challenging. How can nuclear establishment can induce a level of confidence among the people that it has the capacity, technology, and willingness and power to deal with fallout of, to make sure that nuclear fallout would not happen. It's possible. But you need to have a desire to explain to people, and you also need to understand people can also understand. Isn't it? When you understand that people have a right to know, what nuclear power can do, okay, if it explodes, what it can do, and what all the steps that have been taken in order to safeguard that fallout, and take precautions to see a situation whereby you create confidence and re-establish the livelihoods of people, can deal with, the competing rights are being taken into consideration, so that you know that yes, somebody's rights were violated, but at the end of the day, you have done the remedial measures in order to make sure those rights are being replaced. So development, according to the right to development, which we will be seeing now, is about this. Okay, so because in development process, there has been always competing rights, in the sense that somebody wants irrigation, drinking water. Like why do Thane people chase come to Mumbai because we take away their water. Okay? They are chasing their water because all the dams are full now. So Mumbai people are happy because their dams are full. But is that going to give water to the people of Thane? Thane district, the tribal people of Thane district? No way. Water is not available. Last year, some of my students went to do micro-planning in one of the villages near what dam? Vaitarna? Tansa. You have a big dam, it contains the water of their ecosystem, but they themselves don't have water. So there is a small leakage from that water pipe, and that is their water source. Now, for a nascent state that is able to create dam, Yanama, who is that? Huh? You cough. You cough. Keep coughing. Okay? For a nascent state that is able to create a dam, that is able to create the pipeline to bring water, certainly able to create a system whereby local people also get water. That's competing rights. How do you, when you take away rights of some people, how do you repair it? Okay, that's what it means. Okay, so Kodamkulam is not an issue which should have been such a serious issue actually. But the trouble is that, we don't think that people understand. People understand. I think, we don't think that they understand, but they understand. They understand that you don't understand them. Okay? Yanama? Political? No, don't take name. Now, all decisions are political. Okay, if you were to say some decisions are political, some decisions are not political. Because political in the sense that it is done with some intent. Can be public purpose, may not be public purpose, but this is done with some intent. But at the end of the day, whether it is within the legal framework or not is something which is to be determined, isn't it? If certain decisions are not within the legal framework, okay, even the political decisions which is not in the legal framework, it can be corrected. The coal blocks is an important story in that count actually. So Supreme Court saying that those decisions were wrong. It can be, but what Eleanor Roosevelt says that that's where the public action come into the picture. Now how do you secure those rights? How do you secure those rights against odds? Is an important area of discussion and debate actually. In the sense that in a system of unequal power relations, decisions may not necessarily benefit all people. Democratic values is about how do you bring in that balance to those decision making in a sense whereby some people's rights cannot be violated. Okay, so it's not to say that political decisions will not be made for political benefits and individual benefits, but how do you deal with it within a broader democratic framework becomes the important part of it. I'm feeling cold. In this, okay, so participatory. The development should be participatory, people-centered, and environmentally sound. Very interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Look, if you were to, how do you convince, you know, Japan is you need to look at the ecosystem of Japan. Japan is a country which is prone to, it's a seismic nature, and it is also located in a situation which is also highly prone to cyclones, typhoons. Okay. Now, certain forms of systems are not appropriate to certain ecosystems. Get me that? Certain forms of energy systems are not appropriate to certain ecosystems. So, at the end of the day, how do you convince people? It happened in Japan, the disaster happened fundamentally because the energy system that is based on nuclear power was not conducive for the overall makeup of the Earth system of Japan itself, because the entire Pacific Rim is highly seismic, and that was a disaster that was bound to happen. Okay? So basically, how do you convince people is by education, giving information, seeking consent, and that's what, you know, the beauty of our 73rd Amendment to the Constitution and right to development is that it provides for negotiation, it provides for consulting, it provides for treating people as equal, people as someone who can understand. And that's where the science of assessing options, you know, what would be the best option suitable for that particular location becomes very important. Very often we don't seek options. You know, like I was doing a study on dams in Karnataka. There is a dam called Narayanpur Dam in northern Karnataka. You know, the amount of land that will be irrigated by Narayanpur Dam is equal to the amount of land it will submerge. Now, no, you don't need any mathematics to say that there will be no cost-benefit analysis to be done there, because you are choosing to construct a dam in a place which is not suitable for constructing a dam. Got that? Whereas Almaty, which is upstream of Narayanpur, was a site where you can construct a dam, okay, which can hold more water but doesn't submerge so much land. So, so nuclear plant 2, is it the most appropriate place to construct it? That comes the important part of it. But that's where, you know, negotiation, discussion, debate, information provision becomes far more important.